Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakare Chatman,
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. Welcome to Constitutional Chats. How are you tonight? Thanks for joining us. My name's Janine Turner, and I am an actress by trade. I'm also the founder and co-president of Constituting America, and we launched this fabulous, wonderful Constituting America Foundation 10 years ago. Can you believe that? And so Cathy Gillespie is our co-host tonight, and Cathy Gillespie is a co-president of Constituting America. I always like to say that it takes a left wing and a right wing to fly, and without Cathy, I would just be flapping around trying to get projects off the ground. She's one of the 16 people who have been asked to be on the Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which is helping organize our country's 250th birthday in 2026. So we're very proud of her for that. That's a wonderful, prestigious position. So say hello, Cathy.
Hi, everybody. We're glad that you're here.
Tova Love Kaplan. We're going to put up Tova. Tova is 16. You're not going to believe that she's 16 years old. She lives in Chicago, Illinois. She currently serves as Constituting America's National Youth Director and runs the National Youth Advisory Council, like a CEO, I might add. She is a 3-time winner of our Constituting America's We the Future contest. Please check it out. Great opportunities for your kids to stay busy all summer with our contest entries. She won Left Brain, Right Brain. I like to brag on her. She won in the entrepreneurial category where she created a marketing plan. I think she was in middle school when she did that. She won for Best PSA, which is a short commercial. She directed and starred and wrote it. It's fantastic. And then she also won for STEM, where this past year where she created an app. Isn't that amazing? Say hello, Tova.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
All right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dakare Chatman. Dakare Chatman is our Constituting America student ambassador. He is 16 years old as well, is currently a junior and a full-time college student in South Carolina. He has won Constituting America's We the Future contest. This is how we get to know all these brilliant students. He's won Constituting America's We the Future contest. Once again, please check it out at constitutingamerica.org. He won for Best PSA, where he reminds viewers the Constitution is an American thing, so know it. And he also won for a short film, Man on the Street. He's actively involved in our National Youth Advisory Board with Tova, Tova is our director. He is a working actor, everyone. Seen most recently in HBO's The Righteous Gemstones and in Netflix Outer Banks, which was just released April 15th. Dakare wishes to be an actor, but also a politician, but he says you must be an actor to be a politician. Say hello, Dakare.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here.
All right, I'm going to tell you very quickly about Jeanette Kranek. Jeanette Kranek is our Director of Operations. So if you would like to book a live Zoom into your classroom, which could be private, or another Zoom just like this, the person with whom to speak is Jeanette Kranek. And there's a little button at Constituting America that says Book a Speech. I think that's under the George Washington Speaking Initiative. Say hello, Mrs. Kranek.
I'd love to reach out to all the scout leaders. I know scouts are taking a different direction this year. You're not going to be outside camping, so Zoom with us and get in touch with me at Constituting America. Thank you.
That's right. We've already booked quite a few Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts too. Yes, and Heritage Girls, American Heritage Girls, any group. And now Lisa Williams. Say hello, Lisa.
Hi, y'all. How's it going?
Lisa is our Director of Communications, and she is the technical guru who puts this entire Zoom together. So what would we do without her? And not to mention, she edits. She's a wonderful editor, and she edits all of our videos that are on, most of them, the new ones at constitutingamerica.org. We now have testimonials from the contest winners from elementary school all the way up to college who talk about their their inspiration, the genesis of their idea, and all about their idea. Those are now at constitutingamerica.org. They're in Zoom form, but they're very informative. Kids, all the students give wonderful, wonderful hints and ideas about how to join the contest. And Lisa edited those. Okay, now our special constitutional expert, last but most definitely not least, Rachel Greszler. Rachel, get this, she is brilliant, obviously, but she's also a mother of 6 young children. How she's managing to do this tonight, I have no idea. Rachel is a research fellow in economics, budget, and entitlements at the world-renowned Heritage Foundation. Rachel received her Bachelor of Science degree in economics from the Mary Washington College and her graduate degree from Georgetown University, where she earned her master's degrees, plural, in both economics and public policy. Before joining the Heritage Foundation in 2013, Rachel was a senior economist on the staff of the Joint Economic Committee of the Congress for 7 years. Rachel Greszler, welcome to Constituting America's Zoom Constitutional Chats tonight.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. Everyone, let's give Ms. Dressler a round of applause. There we go. That's what I do with the kids. Well, where to begin? We are going to talk tonight about how the coronavirus has taken a bite out of how can we afford it, both from a health standpoint and a stimulus and economic standpoint, and how can our country afford it? So, man, I was looking at your long bio, and you are the one with whom we need to be speaking with tonight. It's just really, really, really impressive. So I guess I'm going to ask the first question, and you might have a slide or two. Do you want to put a slide or two up first?
Yes, so we can start with my first slide,
Okay.
which just talks about, what is the best response when we have a situation that we're facing right now. And I can Yep, did you have a question, or do you want me to go ahead and start?
You go ahead.
Okay. Well, before talking about COVID-19 and where we are today, I just wanted to briefly talk about where we were, the beginning of this year and in the past years entering into this situation. And we were in a really strong economy and especially strong labor market prior to this. Our unemployment rate was at a half-century low in February of this year. And we'd seen really strong growth in the economy, strong wage growth, and it was especially strong for lower income workers and some of those more marginalized workers. We saw the percentage of people who would classify themselves as being marginalized or disadvantaged, discouraged. So those are people that they aren't technically looking for a job, and so they aren't counted in the unemployment rate, but they say that they would like a job if something was actually available. We saw the percentage of those people in the economy drop by 25% over just the last year prior to COVID-19. So that means that all these people that hadn't been working before were in the economy, they were producing things, and that's why it was growing so well, and we were seeing wages rise as well. And then came COVID-19. And so this is different than a normal recession or depression, where there are fundamental things that are wrong with the economy that cause things to start cycling downwards. This was something that was induced by both a health pandemic and then the government's response to that, where it was forcing businesses to shut down and close their doors. And so when we look at what was actually done and what is the right response for Congress in this situation, if you're going to be trying to stimulate or to I think of it more as bridging the gap. So we were going straight and then we really just dropped off. But we know that we can come back up. This is a temporary health crisis. It's not going to last forever. And so we'd rather just keep things straight going across that. And so you really want to fill the gap there. And so I have a couple slides here that are showing, targeted relief. You think about these are basically 10 percentile groups of Americans. And so everybody's there and they're earning their normal wages that they usually do. And then the crisis hits. And a lot of people either have fewer hours of work and income, or maybe they've lost all of their work and income. But then you see in a couple spots, they're actually above the line they would normally be at. And this is like the Amazons, the grocery stores, the Targets that everybody is flocking to. And so they actually have been hiring people and they're producing more. And so one thing that Congress talked about and that they actually did is just send checks to everybody, because it's a quick way to get money out the door. And so you can see that down in the bottom left corner there. You send everybody a little bit of money. And so it ends up being just a windfall benefit for those people who kept their jobs or who had, more business going on. They don't really need it, but they're still getting it. And then for the other people on the right-hand side, some of them, it helps a bit, but it's not enough, especially if you've lost your job entirely, because it's only a small portion of what you were making, and it's not going to be enough to get by. And so the better response there is to kind of meet everybody where they are. And as I said, try and bridge that gap, and you fill in, maybe you've lost 10 hours of work a week. And so we want to try and fill that in. Maybe you've lost your whole job. And so for a short period of time, we want to kind of keep those people whole, because it's not anything that was fundamentally wrong with the economy. Those jobs, we hope, will come back quickly as soon as businesses reopen. But of course, things have taken a longer turn than we expected for them to. We originally thought this would be a couple weeks, maybe a month, 2 tops, and we're already at 2 months now, and just getting to the point where certain places in the country are starting to reopen. And so what looked like it could be a temporary downturn and we would just bounce right back up, kind of a U-shaped or V-shaped recovery, is probably going to turn into a recession. We hope not a depression. So a recession is technically when you have 6 months or more of the economy's growth declining, GDP declining. It's a depression if it's more like a year or a couple years that are going on. We called the most recent recession the Great Recession because it was a really long recession. It wasn't quite a depression, but it was very long. So that's where we are now, and just thinking about, what are the best responses? We can look at what Congress has done so far. The next slide up will show just the dollar amount of what Congress has done. So you can see there, we spent about $2.4 trillion, and that's more than we spend on any of our other biggest programs in the economy. So what is that amount? What does that consist of? There's a bunch of different things. Just trying to get my list up here. So the first thing was the checks to households that I told you about. So Americans got on average $1,200 per person, $2,400 for married couples, an extra $500 per children. And so that helped, as that graph pointed out, but it's not necessarily the most targeted response. 2 of the biggest targeted things that Congress did was something called a Paycheck Protection Program. And that really does try to do what I demonstrated with kind of bridging the gap. And so this was aimed at small businesses who have fewer than 500 workers. And they call it a loan, but really it's just a grant. And so it gives these businesses who come and apply for this loan the amount that's equal to 2.5 months worth of their payrolls. So say you had, 10 workers who were each making $5,000 a month, then you would get that, you multiply that by 2.5 months and you get that amount of money. You can use it to keep your workers on their payrolls, even if they're not actually coming into work anymore. So it's supposed to address what we thought would be a roughly 2-month slowdown, shutdown in the economy. And it's been quite successful. It actually ran out of money and Congress passed more money. So we've seen a ton of businesses that have been able to use this, but it doesn't do anything on the bigger business side. One other provision that Congress has passed is additional unemployment insurance benefits. And this is helpful, but they didn't really do it in the best way they could have. So normally when somebody loses their job, they have to actually be laid off and they can go to their state and they collect unemployment insurance benefits. And that's about 50% worth of what they would normally be making. So they're not going to keep paying you your full paycheck, but it's just something to try and help you get by as you find a new job. Well, with so many people becoming unemployed and in a forced situation, but also a temporary situation, Congress wanted to replace a higher portion of their income. So what would have made sense is to say, we're going to give you 90%, 100%, but instead they kind of arbitrarily came up with $600 more per month, thinking that this would help the average person get up to about 100% of their earnings. But in reality, it created a situation in which a majority of Americans can make more from not working, from losing their job, than they can from working. And so that is starting to be problematic. We saw it come into play with businesses who were maybe not producing as much and they were still able to keep all of their employees on the payrolls. And then this benefit was passed and they said, well, we're going to lay you off because you're actually going to make more money from unemployment. And then we don't have to pay your paychecks and we're all better off. So it ended up increasing unemployment by a lot more. And just this past week, we did receive the employment figures for April, but that's actually not where we are today. It misses about 2 weeks, but we have seen 1 out of every 5 Americans has filed for unemployment over the last 8 weeks. So this is the highest we've been, really since the Great Depression. But we have that benefit that's there, and that is starting to impact people as the economy is reopening in some states and businesses want to call their workers back. And they're starting to have the workers say, we don't want to come back to work because we're making so much more on unemployment. We're going to wait until these benefits run out at the end of July. And to their credit, I mean, somebody who is a lower wage worker, they could be making between $5,000 and $8,000 more over the course of these benefits are available if they don't work versus if they do work. And so we have estimated this at the Heritage Foundation. We put out an analysis showing that it could actually reduce the output in the economy by between like 1 trillion and 1.5 trillion if people don't come back to work and start producing things. So we see this as really problematic and hope that that's one of the things that Congress will fix going forward. So those are kind of some of the biggest assistances that are out there. And then there's also more lending by the Federal Reserve, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit later.
Okay, well, I thank you for that. That was very informative, and I have so many questions, but I think, let me recap what you just said for our younger listeners. First of all, tell us again, a recession is how many months, as opposed to a depression is how many months?
2 quarters, so 6 months or more is a 6
Well,
months. 6 months is a recession. A depression.
And what's a depression?
Is at least a year, more like 2 years usually. Multiple years.
Okay. All right. And so to also recap, people are getting these checks, and now they're making more money than they would make if they went back to work.
Workers are, right?
That's really, and if they don't go back to work, we can't get the economy revved up to help pay for all of this, because that's one of my other questions. And then it's interesting because my neighbor was over yesterday and she was talking about the fact that her plant, where they work, they are just now letting people go, which is interesting because supposedly we're supposed to be on the upswing here, and yet they're starting to let people go. So I'm wondering so it seems like we have 2 different things. We have employees that don't want to go back because they're making more money than they would if they went back, and then we also have employers who are letting people go because, tell me why they were letting people go.
It depends on every business's situation going into this, but especially smaller businesses tend to have about a month, maybe 2 months top worth of cash flows that they can keep things going. And so we've kind of gotten past that point where anybody who had enough cash to keep operating, at least on the small business side, no longer has that there. And so they might have been trying to hang on to everybody as long as they could, but they weren't able to. And it also may be that they didn't get this loan. There's a lot of demand for the loans and the banks haven't been able to process them that quickly. I know that's the case with, one of the businesses that I was helping. They just this week got the loan, but it wasn't in time that they could keep their workers on the payroll. So they had to put them onto unemployment for at least a couple weeks there.
Okay. All right. I'm going to go to Tova Love Kaplan to ask a question now.
Okay, so first of all, thank you. It's it's one thing to know in the back of your mind what's happening with the economy. It's another thing to see it right in front of you in graphs. So thank you for showing that to us. I was wondering, a very simple question, but very important. How are we paying for all of these incredibly large spending projects? Will that result in an increase in taxes for Americans or an increase in debt? And how are we paying for it? And how will this impact our economy and our reliance on foreign debt in long term?
Mm-hmm. So how are we paying for it? It's all debt. And unfortunately, we didn't start in a good place. It is a situation where you would justify spending money and going into debt to some degree, but we started out with debt that was already $24 trillion, almost 100% of our amount that we produce in a year. And now we're going to be past that with this year. So going into this, we already had enough, every person in the United States essentially owned $73,000 worth of the US debt. And then if you think of your household, every household owned $188,000 of US debt. And this doesn't even account for the money of like Social Security and Medicare, these promises we've made, but we haven't actually set aside the money to pay them. And then when COVID-19 came, we basically increased that by 10%. We've added about 2.4 trillion on top of a $24 trillion. So just in response to COVID-19, the US has spent $7,300 for every person in America, or about $18,800 per person. And then when you look at, just in general, this was before COVID-19, this graph here showing what the US is spending if it were actually a household. And so median family income in the US is about $63,000. So consider if every year your household continued to spend $75,000 and put $12,000 on a credit card, even though you already had a credit card bill of $393,000. So we know that on a household level, this is not sustainable at all. As a federal government level, yes, they can keep passing it on to future generations, but when we have already placed $73,000 of debt on every American, and that's growing over time, that's a tremendous amount of money. And at some point, we need to start paying that back. Unfortunately, the situation going forward just gets worse and worse in terms of the amount that we've committed to spend. Let me see if there's another chart here. Yeah, so the next one, federal spending per capita soars. You can kind of see where we are 2020 today, and it's just going to keep going. So this is, we are spending a lot of money. It's not that we're not collecting enough in taxes. We're just spending too much, and every year it just keeps going up and up. And then the next chart coming there says, what is devouring our taxes? And you can see what we're spending all that money on. Right now on the far left, you see there's a gap of white that we're actually still able to spend some money on all the discretionary things that the government does. But once we get to 2041, the only thing that our tax revenues will actually finance is Social Security, Medicare, and paying the interest on our debt. And this chart was actually done pre-COVID, so our interest on our debt is already much higher than is shown there. So we'll certainly hit that point sooner. So the reality is, Americans are going to pay for everything that we are spending today. And it might seem like free money, whether you're getting unemployment insurance benefits or whether it's the states that are saying, look, we're losing revenues because places are shut. We need the federal government to give us money. It seems like, oh, the federal government is free if it comes from them. It's not. It seems free now because we're able to borrow at low interest rates, but at some point you lose that ability to borrow, and nobody knows when that happens. We've seen other countries like Greece or Puerto Rico, suddenly a debt crisis hits and people don't want to borrow anymore and they stop being willing to. And that's when, it becomes a crisis type situation.
Okie dokie. Yeah. Okay. It's like, woo, this is so much fun. Explain, I'm going to go to Dakare next, but explain what discretionary spending means to our students that are here. We have discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending. Because what your graph showed is that by, I think 2029, but maybe even earlier, we will have no money for discretionary spending. Would that mean that the congressmen and women wouldn't get any pay?
That would mean that. But it would unfortunately also mean that we don't have a national defense, which is the primary reason that we have a federal government, is to defend ourselves. And so discretionary spending is really, it's almost everything that we think of the government doing, other than sending people Social Security checks and Medicare checks and Medicaid, Obamacare. These are things that the Congress doesn't have to budget them and pass a spending bill for them every year. It just says you are entitled to this benefit, and whatever money is needed will keep coming out. And so, like I said, it's these Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all the healthcare programs, and then we have to pay the interest on our debt. If we don't pay the interest that's due on our debt, then we lose the ability to borrow. But everything else.
Do you want to show that graph as before we go to Dakare here of the debt from foreign entities? Which was that the next slide?
It's number 4.
Japan. Most of our debt.
It's number 4, Lisa.
What?
Debt held by foreign entities.
Okay, there you go. U.S. debt. So so right now, is it now or in the next how many years? We can only pay for discretionary spending. No, wait, we can only pay for the mandated spending like Social Security and whatnot, and the debt. So look at this debt. So Japan, China, Britain, Brazil, it's really interesting to see who owns our debt. So in other words, just so students understand, we're borrowing money to pay for all these discretionary, non-discretionary spending. We're borrowing money as well as our economy, of course, but we're also borrowing money because we don't have enough. And then at any time they can, like I heard China may call their debt. Can they call their debt whenever, or is this debt for our students that understand? Is there a time element to these to the debt, mainland China's debt?
So when the government issues debt or treasuries, they're issued with a certain term, and they could be as short as a couple of months, a year, 10 years, 30 years. And so any country or any individual can have any different length of debt that they owe. But say that China just decided, we don't want our $1.1 trillion in US debt that we own anymore. They could sell it all in the market. And there is demand today to have US debt because it's considered a very safe asset because nobody thinks we'll default on it. But they could just sell that in the market. The cost for them would be that when you kind of, it's like if you, I'm trying to think of a good example, you're increasing the supply of everything that's available. And so you own something and you're like, oh, I want to get rid of this quick. I don't want it anymore. Well, then it becomes less valuable because there's more of it available and you've said that you don't want it anymore. And so the price of it would go down essentially. And so China wouldn't collect 1.1 trillion when they went to sell it. Maybe they would get 1 trillion. So they would lose a little bit of money if they were to do that. But it is something
Okay.
that I don't think that it's going to happen in the current situation because people are actually tending to want to buy a lot of US debt today. When the stock market plummeted, it's not that all that money just disappeared. It's that people took it out in fear that they were going to lose a lot, and something that is not, that's considered safer is investing in US treasuries. You're not going to make 6% per year, but you don't think that it will decline by 25% either.
Okay, Dakare, your turn.
Yes, Ms. Gressler, thank you so much for being here. You're pretty phenomenal. I'm just blown away. It's like better than any macro or microeconomics class I've ever taken in my life. So my question to you is, like Tova, very simple but relevant. So we know that the middle class is the backbone of our economy, right? Mm-hmm. So after COVID-19, how do you foresee the middle class? Do you think it won't exist, or will you see a slight increase? What is your prediction?
It's hard to know exactly. We have seen a mix. The job losses at the beginning, they tended to be more on the lower income side, but now the longer this is going on, we're seeing it being higher up the income scale, but it is still somewhat disproportionately shifted to middle to lower income people. We hope that those jobs will come back. But the reality is the longer this goes on, the more of those job losses that will be permanent. And one of the things that I fear is that if we do have situations where it's a really expanded shutdown period, or we have rolling shutdowns, or we have situations where workers choose not to go back to work because they're making more unemployed, well, then employers and businesses have to start thinking about the long term. And that's where they might start saying, some of these jobs that I had, I could have done by a computer or a machine instead. And then those jobs don't ever come back. And you get a situation where there's a certain group of workers in the economy that don't have the skills and education to have any job at all, because you've just wiped out kind of the bottom end of the jobs. And it's somewhat similar to what happens when you significantly raise the minimum wage too high, is that you create a survival of the fittest labor market, and then certain people don't have any options out there anymore. I'm not fearful of that yet, but the longer this happens, if we didn't get a vaccine and we see that there's going to be a year or 2 years worth of these continual shutdowns until we have herd immunity, then I would have concerns that some of these jobs are just not going to come back. And then we really have to see, what do we do so that we can have those middle and lower income jobs available?
So tell me again, tell our listeners again, why July? Why July? in other words, people don't want to go back to work until July.
Yeah, when Congress passed the CARES Act, they just decided for some reason that they were going to have these benefits available until July 31st. They also extended normal unemployment benefits, that roughly 50% that the state pays, that's available until December. But for some reason they said July 31st, you can get this extra $600. And what I'm worried about is that they're already talking about extending that, or, well, what if we just give that extra $600 to everybody, regardless if they go back to work or not? But then you start creating real inequities. We already have that situation now. And, you know, I look at like a daycare center that is providing services for the children of essential workers, and they're earning their normal wage. Maybe it's $15, $20 per hour. And then all those other daycares that have been forced to shut down, those workers are sitting at home and they're probably making $25, $30 an hour to stay at home. And so you have this really inequitable situation where the people who are going in every day and doing the hard work are making significantly less than those that aren't working at all. And we don't want that to become a long-term thing. And that's something that, you know, I think that part of the reason that this was put into place was certain lawmakers thought this would be a good idea because it would force employers to have to raise their wages that they pay the workers in order to get them to come back. But the reality is a lot of these small businesses, especially like grocery stores and restaurants, they operate on really small profit margins. And so they might make only 3 to 5 cents out of every dollar that they sell. And so you can't just pay your workers twice as much as you were before, because then you have to double your prices too. And if you double your prices when people are already in a downturn economy and they don't have as much income, they're just not going to buy your product anymore. And then the business goes out of business permanently.
You know, that leads to a question that we can come back to because I want to go to Cathy here, but gosh, I just totally lost my, how are we going to pay for it? Lost my train of thought for a second. How do we pay for this? And I saw, you know, an article that was talking about whether potentially, you know, whether Democrats and Republicans may have to raise taxes in order to pay for this. But let's go to Cathy's question, because I'd like an answer on that. If Democrats and Republicans are going to have to raise taxes, because how are we going to pay for it? To Cathy, hi.
Hi. Rachel, thank you so much for being here. This has been fascinating. I want to go back for a second to the whole issue of the debt, because I think there's a real perception that the Federal Reserve is just creating money out of nowhere. And are you saying that we're really not creating money out of nowhere, we're borrowing it? I just wanted to clarify that.
Well, so monetary policy is complicated and hard to explain in short terms, but it kind of is like the Fed is creating money out of thin air. So what it's doing is in addition to all this 2.5 trillion that we have spent, the Federal Reserve has actually increased what's called its balance sheet, the things that it owns, the assets it owns, by $2.5 trillion as well. It's an enormous amount of money. And so how have they done that? They go out and they buy things like treasuries, which are US debt, or mortgage-backed securities, or things that these financial institutions, banks, and investment companies, what they own, they buy, the Fed buys it. And so it's effectively then, it credits those banking institutions with reserves. So all the banks have to hold reserves with the Federal Reserve. And so by doing that, they have essentially created cash within those banks, and then they go out and they can lend that money. And so in the reverse, you know, we hope that eventually the Fed will be able to scale this back. It did this in 2009. It increased its balance sheet. And then over the past years, it's actually been rolling that back and bringing it lower. But now we're seeing it expanding again. And so in a way, it kind of is creating money out of thin air. But because people are otherwise holding on to the money, it's not as risky to be doing that. But of course, you know, things could get out of hand and it could be more risky. But right now, the situation with the demand being so high for US debt and it being a safe asset and people otherwise holding back, right now it looks steady for the time being, but certainly it's risky and it's unprecedented for it to be doing some of the measures it has.
We've got a question from a listener. Do you want to go to that now, or?
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. My question's a little off topic, but it certainly is related to it. And, you know, with the government forcing all these closures to businesses and forcing businesses to close and people to lose their jobs, are we at some point at risk of losing our freedoms as Americans?
Yes, and I think that's, a point that we're starting, the longer this goes on, people are like, hey, can you really keep doing this that long? And that's certainly an issue that we have to be concerned about. And, giving up freedoms, it shouldn't be taken lightly, even if it seems to be a small freedom that can really spiral out of control. And we have seen cases, of government shutting down church services when people just go in their cars into a parking lot. I think that's become a lawsuit now, but we need to be pushing back against these freedoms being taken away from individuals and families and businesses.
Yes, there was a big situation here in Dallas. So did you hear about that, Rachel, where she had a beauty salon and she opened it because she just needed to pay for her kids to eat, and her employees needed to be able to, their kids needed to be able to eat. And anyway, she got put in jail. It was really, but then the governor passed something and got her out of jail. It was quite the story. And that alludes to what Joe Smucker was talking about. Do we have the right to go to our stores and open our businesses? So Tova or Dakare, we have, believe it or not, 20 more minutes. I'm going to throw you a little hint because Tova, I believe you even mentioned this when we were doing our pre-call earlier in the week about what the responsibility of the states, didn't you? I think the states, the federal government bailing out the states and that type of thing. So hint.
All right, so I think Janine, that brought up a great point about what is the financial responsibility of the states and how is that kind of divided between the federal government and the states. I know you talked a little bit about that, but is it going to come down harder on the federal government or on the state government? And how is the federal government how will it affect certain states differently, I guess, is another question. And then how is the federal government going to help make sure that the state governments aren't overwhelmed as well with all of the unemployment and financial damage?
That's a great question. And that's actually becoming really relevant right now in Washington. And it's the issue that Congress is looking at most, is they talk about having yet another package that will be passed. It started out with, can we have $150 billion for the states? And then it was $500 billion and $700 billion and $1 trillion. And now it's pared back to $500 billion. But we've seen a lot of the governors get together and ask for money to the states. But states are their own sovereign entities. They run their own budgets. They have their own responsibilities of what they pay for within the state, and they have their own authority to collect tax revenues, and they can choose how they collect those tax revenues, from income taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, gas taxes, all these things that they put together. And so they really have a lot of their own responsibility. We have seen over the years that the federal government has tended to start providing more and more funding to the states. Sometimes it's even like an unfunded mandate. They'll say, we're going to require you to follow our Medicaid rules, and you're going to have to pay for this portion of it, and we'll give you some of it. So today, this federal government actually funds about 30% of state and local governments' costs. And that has gone up significantly over the past couple of years, in past couple of decades, I guess even. But the situation that we're looking at today is that states are really run kind of differently. The American Legislative Exchange Council puts out a report every year called Rich States, Poor States. And it goes through their different policies and whether or not their economy is growing as a result of this. Are they losing people because the population doesn't like the policies that are being put in place by the state, or they don't like how high the taxes are? And so it's neat that we have this kind of laboratory of democracies that are the states, and we can see what policies work and what ones don't. And so going into COVID-19, some states were really well prepared. So states in general are not like the federal government in being able to just borrow as much as they want. A lot of them have done the right thing, and they've passed essentially balanced budget amendments. They still are able to borrow to some degree, but they have actually been fiscally more responsible than the federal government, but not all of them. So they have rainy day funds that they're supposed to save money for when something like this hits, or when there's a recession, or say that, you know, you rely on gas taxes and the price of gas goes down a lot, you're supposed to save up and have this money there, just as Americans are supposed to have 3 to 6 months worth of our income in case something happens. So going into COVID-19, states like Wyoming actually had an entire year's worth of revenue saved up. You know, across the US, it was probably closer to a couple months worth of revenue. But then you had states like Kentucky and Illinois that had 15 minutes worth of revenue saved up or nothing at all. And so they weren't prepared. And this was after having a really strong economy when they were collecting a lot of tax revenues and incomes were high, and they should have been saving ahead, but they weren't. And then one other issue that's really big in the state and local governments is pensions. And I know this will be very boring to younger generations, and you're probably never going to have a pension and don't care that much about them. But what a pension is a promise to pay your worker something in the future. And it's gotten to the point that all these states and the politicians running them will make these promises so that they don't have to pay the workers more in wages. And they can say, well, instead, we're going to pay you a higher pension, but then they don't put the money aside. And so then the pensions come due and they have to take it out of their regular tax revenues because it's not like a 401k where it was sitting there and growing over time like it was supposed to. So the states as a whole have about $5 trillion worth of these unfunded pensions sitting there. And Illinois is one of the worst. You know, it has $137 billion of unfunded pension liabilities. And it's coming to the point where they, you know, Illinois, I think, actually cannot raise taxes enough or cut services enough. So they've asked.
Can I interject for just 1 second because we're running out of time? Can you tell me how this works with the coronavirus? Because I know that Mayor de Blasio is saying until you bail us out, we're not going to open up. So I think I'm really curious about what's going on there. De Blasio wants a bailout. Explain to our listeners who wants a bailout for what exactly. And I think Trump is saying no, and then he's saying I won't open up. So what is going on there with that dynamic? Right? Just explain that one between de Blasio and New York City and the federal government, Donald Trump.
I think an issue here is there is a role for the federal government to be paying for direct coronavirus, COVID-19 expenses, and certainly the healthcare costs of them. And they have actually already sent money to the states to do that. And it's actually been more than enough because some of the states have said we can't spend this all on coronavirus things. We want to be able to spend it on something else. And they've also given them enormous access to borrowing money. So the coronavirus, the shutdowns have forced the states to do things that have resulted in them losing revenues like sales tax revenues and income tax revenues. But really everything that the federal government has done has been more than enough to help supplement those states. And they will be seeing higher revenues come in through the checks they're sending out, the unemployment insurance, all these things are going to help bolster those state revenues. And really it comes down to the responsibility of the states themselves. They should have planned ahead. And everybody is going to be equally hit by this crisis, but they need to be making balanced decisions, and they need to be weighing, should I reopen now so that we can help increase our tax revenues coming in and people can save their livelihoods, or am I going to wait because I think that the federal government will bail me out no matter what happens? And what this really gets down to is, federal government already has 10 times as much debt as the state governments. And so it doesn't really make sense for the federal government to be the one that would be adding more to its debt. It really should be more down on the state level and also making budget cuts. If states can just be bailed out, they're not going to cut anything from their budget and they're not going to make the changes that they need, especially those changes that have been decades in the making. And I like to think of this more, it's socializing state debts. If we were all to say, okay, we've got a bunch of families here. Some people are going to sit at home and they're going to eat ramen for dinner tonight. Some people are going to go to Chick-fil-A, and some people are going to go out to a steakhouse. They're all going to spend different amounts of money. But what if at the end of that, we just said, okay, we're all going to split the tab. Regardless of what you ate and how much you spent, you're all going to pay an equal amount. And that's what we're looking at when you socialize state budgets. Everybody then has the incentive to go to the steakhouse because they're going to share the cost no matter what, and not to sit at home and eat ramen and save it, because if they save the money, they don't get to keep it. It's savings for everybody else. And this is something that's called the tragedy of the commons in economics. As soon as something becomes a public good that everybody can freely consume, they rush in and take as much as they can, and then you deplete it instead of preserving it in a way that individuals or families would if they were responsible for their own decisions.
Okay. so some states saved, by the way, some states like Texas do have a balanced budget amendment, which I know the federal government really needs. But so some states saved and have enough and some states don't. But I still think there's a bit of a showdown whether, anyway. Okay, Dakare, your question.
Okay, so all of this has been very interesting, but there is one thing that has been going through my mind this entire talk. Not that I haven't been listening, because I promise I have. But my question to you is, what is the big deal with toilet paper, and are we going to have any when this is over?
Full supply on my cupboard here. Yeah, so I mean, part of that is a hoarding thing. You know, when you think that there's not going to be enough of something, everybody goes out and they want to buy it, but it's not like you can hoard milk or these things that you put in your refrigerator because there's a limited space for them, but you can hoard toilet paper and just stack it up in your house. So that's one factor, but it's also an actual shift in the products that we consume. And so a lot of people spend most of their day in an office setting or at work, and those are different toilet paper products, you know, thinner things that are shipped in massive quantities through office supplies. And so it's just been a shift in that. And, you know, maybe we need to start packaging up some of those big office toilet paper boxes into smaller ones that households can buy in the grocery store instead. But I think it's something that will adjust over time. But certainly we saw the short run on toilet paper.
Yeah, I haven't been able to school. Yeah. Okay. The day I can get Clorox wipes, I'm going to be very excited. Okay. I know Tova raised her hand, but Cathy, would you like to ask a question? Do we have a guest that would like to ask a question?
We had a guest that was wondering if fiat currency is unconstitutional. And would you say that when the Federal Reserve is creating money, would you consider it a fiat currency?
I think we need to explain what fiat currency means to the younger audience. So
Well, definitely, because I had to look it up. I didn't know what it was.
You found.
I found that it's a currency that a government creates that's not secured by gold or any sort of backing or standard. Is that right?
So it seems like if you're technically creating money out of thin air, that it would be that. But actually, Congress has given power to regulate money, and they've delegated those powers to the Federal Reserve. And the courts have actually upheld that argument. So the Federal Reserve is in charge of the money supply.
But we hear all the time that they're just printing money, that this is a bad thing, that they just keep printing money. So why is it? Explain that to our listeners, please.
So they're technically not printing actual dollar bills. What they're doing is they're buying up treasury securities and mortgage-backed security, other assets that they're taking out of other financial institutions, and then they are crediting them with cash. So it's kind of, I mean, if we actually still ran with cash, then it would be that they were putting that cash into them. But since they can just give them a credit in their bank account with the Federal Reserve, that's what they're doing instead.
See, this is why it's great to go in depth on subjects instead of just going for clickbait that's out there. Okay, Tova, because we have 8 minutes.
All right, so I'll be quick. So one of I think the most impactful parts of this talk has been your discussion of the U.S. debt, and it's just been really shocking to be able to. I mean, as someone from Illinois, I'm used to debt, but you know, it was really shocking to see it all laid out in front of us. So I was wondering, is the U.S.'s situation of just borrowing so much more than we get in revenue, is the U.S.'s situation unique to the U.S.? Like, my question is, are there other countries that are in similar situations where they are just like other, developed nations that are similar to us that have that system of just borrowing so much debt and not being able to necessarily, getting to that same situation, dire financial situation that we are? And then also my second part of the question is, will this increase in debt make us more beholden to the countries that own our debt, such as Japan or China? Is that something we should be worried about, or does that not have a lot of influence in terms of foreign policy?
So on our debt relative to other countries, we have gotten higher. I mean, our debt has skyrocketed over the last decade or so. And so it hasn't always been as high. As I said, this year we will get over 100% of our GDP will be our debt. And economists have considered like 90% the tipping point. So we are higher than most industrialized economies. One thing that we have going for us that some other countries like in Europe don't is that even though our Social Security and Medicare problems look really bad, theirs are actually a little worse because they don't have as high fertility rates as us. And so they don't have as many young people that are coming in that will be able to pay for all the debt that they have and that they've promised for these retirees. So we are not in a good situation, and yet people still want to buy our debt. And we are kind of the superpower of the world, and we have never reneged on our debt, defaulted on it. And so I think that everybody has confidence that we will repay our debt. But when you look at the amount of it and what our trajectory is, it's hard to understand how we will do that. And are we, at risk of foreign countries saying that they're no longer going to borrow from us or they're going to sell off all our debt? And we just don't know when that happens. I mean, that's the hard thing with financial crises, is that in general, you can say it's around this point of debt that you will start to have negative consequences, but we haven't seen those yet. And we're past that point. And it just, when it does happen, then yes, other countries could be selling off their debt, but really the American public actually owns more of our own debt than these other countries do. And so it's kind of everybody across the world would be in the same type of situation if people lost confidence in the US.
Okay, last closing question, because this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Just brilliant and thought-provoking, incredibly thought-stimulating. So with all the debt, with all those graphs, where it looks so bad, how do we get out of it? Obviously, we need to get the economy going again. And when people start working, the economy, and then there's tax money and all this. But I mean, are taxes going to have to be raised by Democrats or Republicans in order to pay for all of this, the debt that we're incurring from the coronavirus?
Well, at the Heritage Foundation, we don't think so. We do a blueprint for balance, and we show how that we could actually balance our annual budgets within 10 years and slowly bring the debt down. The biggest way you do that is by going back to the founding reasons, the constitutional powers of the federal government. And the reality is we've expanded so far beyond what the Constitution says the federal government should do. And we're spending money on all these things that should either be financed by the state, the local government, or by private individuals and charities. And so that's really how we need to get back to reducing the debt and having a balanced budget, is focusing on what is the federal government really supposed to be doing here. In the short run, I think the reality is we are going to have higher taxes. There's just not going to be enough political will to cut spending to the degree that we need to. And so in some way or another, taxes will have to be higher. And I think that we just need to hope that these spending cuts happen sooner rather than later, and that the tax increases can be as small as possible. Because like I said, if you get to the point where it's a crisis and we weren't expecting it, then you face skyrocketing tax rates and all these cuts in services and benefits. And that's talking about cutting people's Social Security checks, like all these things that will just lead to a downward cycle that could really be a depression with higher taxes and lower government services all around. And it's just not a situation we want to be in.
George Washington talked about the issue with a democracy is that people, have to feel it before they can understand it. And it seems to me that it sounds so good to just start handing everything out to everybody. But if Americans, more Americans really sat down and watched a program like this and heard your wonderful wisdom, they would understand the real debt that we're in, and that the money just doesn't grow on trees, and that we really do have to cut back to balance the budget. And that's why I do think a balanced budget amendment would be really good for Congress. And I know that Congress, we talk about this all the time in the founding forums that I do on Mondays and whatnot. And but that, it's really, really important. It's just really important to understand that a balanced budget is important. But if the federal government's not going to do a balanced budget, we can call a convention of states, or our state's convention, to do it, to do an amendment that way. And I know that we almost have 2/3 of the states for a balanced budget amendment. But do you believe that a balanced budget amendment would help them actually say, wow, we're going to, because right now there's no constraint on the federal government, on Congress, no constraint at all. But if it were to be an amendment, they have to constrain themselves.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what else is going to, people are just going to want to keep winning elections. In order to win elections, they're going to have to promise people all this free stuff. And then we just don't have the money for it, and people don't really understand. So it seems to me that we're going to have to pass an amendment.
Yeah, I think unless it's that strong of a form as a constitutional amendment, then it's not going to hold, because we've seen Congress in the past try to constrain themselves, and they'll put in place even small cuts and say we have to spend this much less these years, and then they waive them in the future because it's too politically painful for them and they don't want to actually have to cut the money. So we need the balanced budget.
That's what I always say, that laws are important. Bills that become laws through the legislative branch and the executive, all that, they're important, but it's an amendment that sticks. You know, so you can join us on Mondays where I teach the Founding Documents Forum, and I talk all about how to start a movement for not only to change something in your area, in your neighborhood, or your country, but also how to start a movement for an amendment. So, well, look, we're here at 9 o'clock. Thank you so much, Rachel Greszler. You were fantastic. And I can't believe that you do this, you do all this, and you have 6 children. How old are your children? Happy Mother's Day, by the way. How old are your children?
They are between the ages of 2 and 11. 3 boys, 3 girls.
Wow! I don't know how you do it. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Well, happy Mother's Day to you.
Thank you, and to all the other mothers out there tonight.
Yes, and thank you for joining us. That was very, 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 very informative.